Hi, this is the Leadership Society, the Daring Dialogues course at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and I'm Professor Brian Lowery. And this quarter, we're discussing leadership in polarizing times, or leading in divisive times. And perhaps the most, or one of the most polarizing subjects in the United States right now, and for a bit, has been gun policy. And today we have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Cass Crifasi. She is a faculty member at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where her work focuses on evaluating the impact of gun policies on public safety. Thanks for joining us, Cass.
Happy to be here.
Great. So you direct research at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy. It's one of the few, as far as I know, academic centers dedicated to this field. How did you become interested in this subject? How did you end up in that space?
Uh, really, long story short, I was a failed medical school applicant, and in that process discovered public health. Rather than fixing people after they're injured, I learned that you could keep people from getting injured in the first place.
Mm,
And training at Hopkins for my doctoral program, I learned about the importance of gun violence and gun violence prevention and how burdensome the issue was, and really thinking about my childhood growing up. I'm grew up in a home with guns. My dad's a military veteran. I personally own guns, and was thinking about how we talk about this issue doesn't really resonate sort of at the political level with what we talk about sort of in our day-to-day lives, how we think about it. And had an opportunity to join the faculty here and think about how we can promote the kinds of behaviors we want to see, how we can use policy as a population level tool to improve safety and health and well-being, but really thinking about how do we meet people where they are? How do we change some of the narrative on this? And really lucky to be here because we do a lot of great research, but we have an amazing advocacy team that helps us translate that work in a way that makes it much more impactful. And so it's been a really rewarding experience being here.
mm. You talked about the narrative around gun policy. And so you're a researcher, so you know quite a bit about what people's perceptions are. I assume you do research into policy attitudes and people's perceptions of the debate. So I'm curious what the data show as compared to the public's perception of the debate around gun policy. Are those things aligned, or are they kind of um, big gaps between people's perceptions around the debate on gun policy and what people actually believe?
There can be pretty big gaps in what people think other people believe and what they actually believe, because what we hear in the media narrative is that nobody agrees on anything, we don't know what works, and so we should just sort of throw our hands up. But we find that gun policy tends to be much more political among politicians than among the general public. So one of the things we do is ask about people's perspectives and opinions on gun policy. We have a survey we do every 2 years. And we started this in the wake of the Sandy Hook shooting because we found that there were really only two questions. Do you want more or less gun control, or should gun laws be stronger or weaker? And even if 100% of people said we should have more laws, that really doesn't tell us anything about what kinds of laws, how do we implement them, where do we put them? And so we got much more specific and asked questions like, do you think people who own guns should be required to lock them up when not in use? Or do you think someone who wants to buy a gun should be required to get a license first to verify their identity? And when you ask those very specific questions, there's much higher support than if you say, do you want more gun control? Because what is that? What does that mean? And when you get specific, you see really broad support, even among people who in the media narrative would be against these policies, gun owners, conservative Republicans. We hear that they're not supportive of these policies, but for many, 75% or more of people in the general public support these policies, including gun owners. And so for us, one of the goals is to think about how can we better communicate that? How can we correct the perception that for the most part, when you're talking about specific solutions to gun violence, it's not nearly as divisive as we might think it would be.
Hmm. And sometimes, by the way, a number of our students are international students. They might not know what Sandy Hook is. So can you
Ah,
just say a tiny bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. In December 2012, there was a school shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut, where an individual gained access to firearms and went to a school and murdered, unfortunately, many children and adults. And that, for many folks, became a catalyzing event that motivated them to move on gun policy and gun safety legislation in a way that they hadn't previously.
Hmm. And and there's been a number of kind of, unfortunately, school shootings and other kind of mass shooting events, and I'm curious about how those things affect the debate. So things have happened since then, and so since you've been studying this, you've had major events, gun violence events, mass shootings. How do those events like that? People, presumably, there's some degree of shared reality. People have seen it; it's in the news. They know it happened. Does it shift the debate? Does it change how people talk about things? How are people responding to that kind of shared experience of some big relevant event?
So it can be a motivating event where individuals say, this thing has happened. I don't want to see this happen again, and I want to advocate for change. It can also sometimes be a distraction, some of these larger high profile events, because we will hear things like, oh, somebody who would do something like this, they're obviously mentally ill. It's not the guns, it's mental illness. And so we need to just address mental illness better, which we do need to address mental illness and access to care much better. But even if we eliminated all interpersonal violence from people who have a diagnosed mental health condition, we're talking 7 to 9% of all violence. So there's still a huge amount of violence that would be occurring between individuals. And I just want to say briefly, people who are experiencing mental illness are far more likely to be victims of violence or to have issues of self-harm as opposed to interpersonal violence. But we often hear about these high-profile incidents, and that is what people think gun violence is. But if you look at high-profile mass shootings, it's less than 2% of all gun violence in the US. The leading cause of gun death is actually suicide, followed by homicide, which can be any form, unintentional shootings as well, but then it's a very small proportion. We also sometimes have a hard time knowing what exactly would have prevented one of these kinds of events, which can make it hard to talk about solutions. But because it can bring attention to the issue, we can sometimes leverage that interest, then talk about preventing the broader issue, because tens of thousands of people die from gun-related injuries every year, and many more are injured and survive. So we often use that as a way to leverage the attention to get folks talking about these solutions.
Hmm. One of the things when we talk about issues that are polarizing, one of the things that strikes me is how people respond to a kind of a shared understanding of the world and still have such vastly different responses to it. So I guess one question I have for you is, do people have a shared understanding of the reality? Do people know when you give them this information about gun violence or gun usage on either side, is there a shared reality? Is there like, yeah, we know the facts and we just see them differently, or do people have different beliefs about the nature of the world?
I think that people have a different belief about the nature of the world. If you ask most Americans right now, do you think uh, crime in general, not just gun violence, do you think crime in general is going up or going down? The vast majority of people perceive that crime is at an all-time high, but it's actually at one of the all-time lows. It's declined significantly over the last 20 years and even more so over the last 50 years. But what we hear in the media is that violence is happening everywhere, crime is happening everywhere, and that misperception that develops from that makes it sometimes hard to have a productive conversation about a range of issues, but gun violence in particular. So one of the first things we do is try to correct some of those misperceptions. When we go talk to policymakers or community groups or advocacy organizations, we start by laying out, what do we know about the data? Who is impacted, whether that's geographic distribution or demographic distribution, really making sure to highlight which groups are impacted by which kinds of violence. So I'm talking about gun violence, but that is a big umbrella: suicide, homicide, unintentional shooting, shootings by police, domestic violence. There's a whole bunch of things that fall into that bucket. So we try to get really much more specific than that when we're talking with groups, particularly policymakers, if we're trying to motivate some kind of change. And we find that can be more helpful. But we're also in a time generally, and I think not just in the US, but across the world, a little bit more in a place where how people feel about things can be hard to counteract with facts. And so making sure we're using narrative, using stories in the data that we're talking about to help people connect to it a little bit better.
Hmm. So here's a question. Interested in public health. Let's say I'm an avid gun user, and I hear that you have guns, you grew up with guns, but I just don't trust you. Like if you're someone who's like, I'm interested in, public health, all right away, I'm like, okay, this person is not someone who's really concerned about the rights of gun owners, right? This is someone who's going to try to curtail my rights. Try to maybe you're not going to take my guns away, but you're going to limit what guns I can have, how I can use them, etc. Why should I listen to you?
You might not ever want to listen to me. And I fully acknowledge that I am not the best messenger to every receiver of a message that they need to have. So, one of the things that has been really important in the work that we're doing is acknowledging that Cass might not be the person that is going to resonate with folks. Maybe it needs to be a pediatrician. Maybe it needs to be a military veteran or a law enforcement officer. Because while I can say over and over, I support an individual's right to own firearms, I just want them to do so responsibly, and we promote the kinds of behaviors that we want folks to engage in. There are people who aren't going to trust that because I do come from a background in public health. And so finding trusted partners who can serve as credible messengers where we have co-created a message that's consistent with what we want to see, but also really resonates with the people who need to receive that. That has been far more effective for us. And honestly, I am among the first to acknowledge that I'm not always the best person to deliver a message, and actually me being in a space might be harmful to a productive conversation. So making sure we get that information into the hands of people who can best use it so that they can educate people.
Yeah, because on the other side, I believe there are about 80 plus million customers of the gun industry. So there are a lot of gun owners in the US. Um, it seems to me that the primary voice when people think about who speaks for gun owners, like the organization that comes to mind is the NRA. And it's actually a relatively small organization compared to the kind of base of gun owners. And I bring this up because I wonder, how do you manage a conversation where you have on the one side someone like you, right? Or someone from your organization who's saying like, let's try to be reasonable about gun usage. But what I hear possibly is you want to take my guns away. And on the other side, you have someone like the NRA, which is, depending on how you think about it, a lobbying group or a group that's really interested in supporting gun owners' rights or the gun industry. If you're on the other side, you think of them as supporting the gun industry. If you're on their side, you probably think of them as supporting gun owners' rights. How do you have a fruitful conversation when you have that sort of dichotomy?
It's a great question. And I want to acknowledge one of the points you made that the NRA gets a lot of attention, but you're right, they're a really small organization. Maybe about 10% of gun owners are members of the NRA, but it's a really powerful voice. So we do a couple of things. One, in our public opinion survey, we look to see support among NRA members. And actually, many of the policies that we think are most effective have really broad support among members of the NRA. And so we can use that. Like, hey, let's get specific about a policy. What do you think about it? Oh, you think this is a reasonable idea? Well, that's consistent with all of these other folks too. And making people feel like they're not an outgroup member if they support a policy, because lots of other folks in that group also support it. And again, for us, it comes back to specific conversations. We do not need to agree on everything to be able to work together. If we can find one thing that we can agree on, then that can be a productive partnership and we can move that one thing forward. And when we're able to do that in a way that is beneficial to both of us, it makes it a lot easier to then do that next thing and really build that trusted partnership, which is so important to us. We can't make meaningful strides to reduce gun violence if we aren't having effective conversations with people who own guns, whether they own them legally or not. doesn't really matter to me, but we need to be engaging folks who have access to guns because you can't have gun violence without guns. So how do we make sure people are using them safely and responsibly?
Hmm. And then one of the things I like, you can't have gun violence without guns because that kind of flips the you know, it's not the guns that kill people, it's people that kill people.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Um, like I wonder about challenging organizations like the NRA that have a strong voice. I mean, you point out, I think, that there are areas of agreement among significant parts of the population. But my sense, and I could be wrong, please correct me if I'm wrong here, is that policy doesn't necessarily shift even when there's significant agreement about what might be better gun policy. Why do you think that is? Like, why isn't, if there's agreement, how come that's not reflected in policy change?
So I have two thoughts. So, one, yes, in general, we may see really broad support for a topic, but breadth of support doesn't translate to depth of support, right? So I may say, yeah, that policy sounds like a really good idea. Am I willing to go do something to advance it, like call a legislator or go advocate or testify? Maybe not. So part of the challenge we have is motivating and activating people who say, yeah, I think this policy is a good idea. And so then trying to educate folks, what do you do then if you feel this way about that topic? And I think we would see more policy change in response to this broad public support with that activation. The other thing I'll say, when you give individuals the ability to make a choice on policy via ballot initiative, we see lots of laws advancing. Washington State passed a couple of gun violence prevention policies via ballot initiative, like you have to be 21 to buy a semi-automatic rifle, for example. Oregon also recently passed a law requiring people to get a license before they buy a handgun via ballot initiative. And so there are ways where, in some states, if legislators are not doing the things that their constituents are supportive of and asking for them to do, we have seen states say, you know what, we're going to take it to the electorate and ask them what they actually think and see what happens. And there we have seen very effective shifts in the way people are activated to go take an action and support a policy. But I think it comes down to, if people support things, you know, what do they know even what to do? Do they know the actions that they could take to make sure that happens? I think the last thing I'll say on that point is, people often think their gun policies in their states are much stronger than they actually are, because people think, well, that makes sense. Of course you would have to do A, B, or C. Of course you would have to pass a background check to buy a gun from somebody you don't know. But in half of states, that's not the case. And so I think part of our challenge also is making people aware, what are the laws in your state? And if you support laws that aren't currently in place, what are some things that you could do to move those forward?
Hmm. And so that's helpful. And there's a lot of barriers, it sounds like, to getting these policies through if people, even when people know, if there's not a lot of commitment. So I wonder if you think about market-based solutions as opposed to mobilizing people in terms of politics.
So I don't know that we have thought a ton about marketing-based solutions beyond the sort of advocacy efforts that we have taken, sort of trying to educate people. But for us, one of the things we care deeply about is opportunities where everybody can have an action, whether they own guns or not. A lot of people are intimidated to contact a legislator, to testify, etc. So one of the things we are really working on is normalizing conversations around safe storage. Unfortunately, too many kids and young people who can't legally buy guns gain access to them because guns are not stored safely in their home or the home of a family member or friend. And so just like we changed norms and expectations and policies around drinking and driving in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, we're working to do that as well. When you send your kids to a friend's house to play, ask the parents about how guns are stored. If you're going to go spend time at a family member or a friend's house, ask, hey, how are your guns stored? You know, recognizing that people own guns for lots of different reasons, but also making it a normal thing to say, you know, you send your kid to a friend's house, make sure they wear bike helmets. Hey, he's got a food allergy, or, don't let them swim unsupervised. Making it normal to ask about that also is a thing we've been working on. And people are more likely to store their guns safely if they have a storage device that's consistent with why they own firearms. So at Hopkins, we give out free of charge cable locks, lock boxes, and biometric safes to people who need them. Because again, it's about promoting what we want to see and really working to advocate for that.
All right, so I have a final question. It might be this one is honestly maybe a little tough and unfair, but I'll ask it anyway. Um, our students are people who are and we can be engaged in all sorts of businesses. And there are many businesses outside of guns that could have negative societal implications, right? So guns are an obvious one. Like it's a business. People are making money selling guns, and there are customers who enjoy and engage with guns in all sorts of ways, not just because they're engaging in destructive violence, right? Let's assume that's a minority of people. But the industry, like, how do we think about being an executive in any kind of industry? It could be AI, it could be social media, it could be guns, where there's a demand for what you're producing. There are many positive uses of it, but there are negative potential consequences as well. Like, how would you, what would you hope that future executives would think about in terms of their products and what they're putting into society? How would they engage with that?
I really like this question. It is a hard question, but I really like it. One of the things that we talk about a lot in gun safety, gun violence prevention, people will draw parallels between like motor vehicle safety and gun safety, which to a certain extent, I think that can work. Sometimes people will draw parallels between guns and tobacco, which I don't think works as well because, for example, as you said, a lot of people find utility and positive value out of firearms. And I think most people, even people who smoke, probably acknowledge that there's not a lot of benefit from tobacco consumption. I like to draw a parallel with opioids because opioids can have, prescription opioids can have real value. I tripped over my cat and broke my arm and had to have surgery, and those pain medication were really beneficial when I was fresh out of surgery because I was in a lot of pain. But used inappropriately, there can be harms, both individual and societal harms when they're used inappropriately, whether that's how they're consumed, how they're prescribed, how they're marketed, right? There can be some harms there. And I think that is probably a better parallel to firearms because there can be a lot of utility, but if they fall into the wrong hands or people choose to not use them safely, or if they're marketed in a way that sort of leads to the wrong kinds of perceptions about how we use firearms and the overall value to society, I think there can be some real challenges. So, regardless of the industry, I'm hopeful that folks would think about there may be benefits, but what are some of the consequences of that product, either intentional or otherwise? And what can you do to try to minimize some of those harms? I'm a public health person. I like to try to prevent as many things as possible. I also am a realist and I recognize lots of people are going to do all sorts of different things that might make it hard for us to eliminate gun violence, for example. But what can we do to make those harms less likely? How can we promote responsible sales practices, marketing practices? That way we're promoting responsible use to the end user. So I don't know that I exactly answered your question, but that's what I'm thinking about.
All right. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time, Cass. It was fun to talk
Yeah,
to you.
great. It was great to talk with you too.